What's going on, everyone? Travis the Stock Geek here once again, and today in this video I want to talk about some of my favorite investing books. Now, there are hundreds and maybe thousands of books about investing out there in the world, but over the past 15 or 20 years, I've combed through a lot of them, and these tend to be my favorites. So there's probably going to be some on the list that you may or may not agree with, but for me, these are the ones that have impacted my strategies and that I find the most valuable. And I'm going to talk about them in a couple different categories. So let's go ahead and start with books that are general about investing. So these are books that cover a number of topics in investing and books that, a beginner could access and understand at least some of the materials. So I actually think that some of the books that are fun to start with as a beginner would be books that have interviews with famous investors. And there's a number of books in this category, and probably the most famous is a book like Stock Market Wizards by Jack Schwager. He has a couple of other versions as well. He's got a follow-up called The New Market Wizards, and I believe one called The Hedge Fund Market Wizards as well. And these just have really great, insightful interviews with famous investors. And I find it's a really entertaining way to really get into investing and understand how some of the great minds of investing think about strategies and think about how they handle risk management and different parts of the investing universe. There are a couple other books in this category as well worth mentioning. More Money Than God is actually a pretty entertaining read and covers a lot of the most famous hedge fund managers and their rise to success, guys like Druckenmiller and Soros, and so you'll find a lot of interesting insights about their early careers. Julian Robertson from Tiger is talked about here, and it talks a lot about the rise of the industry as a whole in terms of hedge funds as well, so that's a good one. There are other books as well by other authors like Inside the House of Money, which is another good one. Again, it's got a bunch of really good interviews with famous investors. There are books, I believe there's one called Alpha Masters that I've read, which is pretty good as well. And then there's also books, we've got a couple books that are actually written by hedge fund managers, which is cool. So David Einhorn, he's the famous founder and portfolio manager at Greenblatt Capital, which is a really famous hedge fund, long short equity hedge fund that has done really, really well up until the last couple of years, actually. But he wrote a fascinating book back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, called Fooling Some of the People All of the Time. One of the reasons why I love this book is because David not only gives us early on in the book an insight into how he runs his hedge fund and how he, does analysis and approaches the research process, but it also really details, a lot of the book actually details his fight against a company that was committing fraud. And it walks us through how he figured out how this company was committing fraud and the lengths at which he tried to go to uncover the fraud and actually help the SEC realize what was going on at this company and the regulators. And a lot of the regulators actually pushed back on him for a number of years, and the stock went against him. He was short the stock, of course. But eventually he did prevail, and the fraud that was happening at this company was revealed. And it's just a really fascinating read. And you can kind of understand what it takes to really get deep into the research process on something and even have an investment go against you and have the conviction to keep fighting the good fight. So those books in the category of insights from actual investors, I think are really good and an interesting place to start. That's a non-technical place to start for investors. Now, in the general category as well, there's a couple of books I think that are really helpful for beginners, and these actually start to delve into some of the tactics of investing a little more deeply. So One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch. I've mentioned this book before. Very famous book, was written I think 25 or 30 years ago. Peter Lynch was one of the best mutual fund managers of the 80s and 90s, had a very stellar market-beating track record. He ran the famous Fidelity Magellan Fund. And Peter has actually a lot of great insights in this book about what to look for in stocks, how to find interesting stocks that are going to outperform the market, what types of metrics to focus on, what things to avoid. And a lot of this book is actually still relevant today, so I find that one to be a really good one. And it covers a lot of different ground in the investing process. Now, a book called The Little Book of Behavioral Investing actually tackles the psychological side of investing, which is often, some of the most important parts of being a successful investor is being able to deal and overcome a lot of the human biases that we all have. Things that plague most people when they first start investing, like overconfidence, information overload, loss aversion, and all the different biases that behavioral finance people and economists now study. And so this book by James Montier actually is a really actually pretty short read, but it covers a lot of ground with behavioral finance and has some really good takeaways for dealing with some of those biases. So that's a great one. Joel Greenblatt, another hedge fund manager who wrote a book. Joel was a really phenomenal hedge fund manager in the 90s and early 2000s. And had a fantastic track record, a lot of really interesting investments that he made. And this book, it's a little bit more technical. It starts to get into some areas and strategies of investing that are lesser known. And the point of this book is to look in places where other investors might not be looking. So Joel covers how to look at things like spin-offs or bankruptcies or restructurings, companies that are just coming out of restructurings. And a lot of these are companies that are overlooked by most investors because they're not the big name companies of the day, right? They're not Apple or Google or Tesla. So he says, this book is all about how to uncover companies that can be massive winners before the market figures it out. So another really good one from Joel Greenblatt. So now one area that I think is really, really important as well is portfolio management and position sizing. And, I've spent a lot of time in my career diving deep into position sizing and portfolio management because even when you find great investments, knowing how to size them correctly and knowing how to scale in, scale out at the right times, and knowing how to basically deal with risk management is as important as finding those investments in terms of actually having a good portfolio result. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and one of the areas that I think is critically important is position sizing, and one concept related to that is the Kelly criterion, and that's starting to get a lot more popular these days as people are discovering that modern portfolio theory, which is what you find in the textbooks, actually leaves some things to be desired and has some errors and inconsistencies. And the Kelly criterion is actually becoming more popular because we think that it's probably the right way to think about position sizing, or at least it provides us a framework to think about position sizing in a helpful way. And this book, Fortune's Formula, is all about how, and it's by William Poundstone, it's all about how we can apply some of the lessons of information theory and Kelly criterion to the world of investing. And it's all about the history as well of how the Kelly criterion developed, about how people like Ed Thorpe, who was a fantastic fund manager and actually a scientist who helped popularize the Kelly criterion. It's about how they developed it and brought it into the actual real world. And so this is a book that's both interesting from a historical perspective, but it's also interesting from a technical perspective. It does go into some of the math behind the probability and statistics around position sizing. And once you're done with this, if you want to go even deeper, there are books like The Kelly Capital Growth Investment Criterion. And this is a very technical book. It's hard to read cover to cover. It's basically a collection of academic papers going all the way back to the 1700s and the development of risk management strategies, the Kelly criterion, Ed Thorpe, Claude Shannon, John Kelly, William Ziemba, all the greats who have contributed to this field academically. You can read the papers and understand in a much deeper sense how this should be applied. I'm also going to do a long post kind of breaking down some of the formulas and some of the intuition behind these position sizing frameworks as well for my newsletter soon, so look for that. But that's a great category. Now, in the technical category, or I should say at least in the foundational category of knowledge, if you're going to be doing fundamental analysis, if you're going to be looking at trying to value companies, and you're going to be looking at financial statements and things like that, then you're going to want a strong grounding in not only financial accounting, but also corporate finance and corporate valuation. And those things can be tackled with textbooks because those things are taught in college and you can find textbooks on those subjects. But I've actually found a book that I think is helpful for understanding those on a practical level. And that book is Analysis for Financial Management. And it's written by Robert Higgins. And I believe there may be a newer version of this out there, so the cover may look a little different. But Analysis for Financial Management, despite having a really boring name, is actually a really phenomenal book because it applies, it has the actual grounding and the technical foundation for things like financial statement analysis, understanding corporate metrics like return on equity, return on invested capital. It goes through valuation methodologies like discounted cash flow and valuation multiples. And it packs that into a pretty small book, and it has a lot of really great examples with real numbers in it. So I find this to be just a really fantastic way to start your journey with learning corporate finance, financial accounting, valuation. It touches on all those concepts and not like in a superficial way, obviously not in as deep of a treatment as going through 3 or 4 textbooks, but it's just a really concise way to hit all of those topics. And then in that category as well, if you're looking at, diving into the study of accounting, because the fact is, when we break down companies and we're doing fundamental analysis, we have to read and understand accounting statements. So the first place you might start with something like that if you don't know accounting is a book like Accounting Made Simple. And this is literally accounting explained in 100 pages or less. And so this is a really quick way to understand the linkages between each financial statement and understand each major financial statement and what goes in those. So the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow statement. And so this is a really nice way to begin that journey. After you do this, you probably also want to pick up like a financial accounting textbook, maybe even an intermediate accounting textbook after that if you want to go deeper. But I think this is a good place to start to really start to understand what you're seeing there when you're looking at a company's financial statements. Another good one in that category might be Financial Shenanigans. And this is a great book because it's both a lesson in how to spot financial misdeeds and in accounting shenanigans, but it's also a way to see some of the historical examples of companies that have done this and been caught, right? The WorldCom, Enrons of the world, and it goes through some of the case studies of how investigators basically figured out companies were committing fraud and some of the ways that companies typically do commit fraud. So it's a good way to understand and be able to pick up on what companies might do to put out fraudulent numbers. So that's a lot of the stuff around stock specific fundamental based analysis. Moving on to some other topics, but still in investing, if you're looking at doing a more quantitative strategy, if you're looking at potentially being a quant or creating software to try to pick investments or do trades, then the category of quantitative investing is pretty broad. But I think there's a couple books that I've read that are pretty interesting in this category. Quantitative Value is a great one. It's by Wes Gray and Tobias Carlyle. And it actually has a sister book, Quantitative Momentum, which is also worth picking up. And basically, these two books are all about how you can apply systematic methods to choosing stocks rather than doing individual analysis. You can actually use software to your advantage using certain rules or even certain algorithms to pick stocks. And that might be a way to find interesting stocks. And they actually prove that there are certain methods that have outperformed the broad market. And so you might be able to create a portfolio of interesting value stocks, for instance, by filtering for certain criteria and using software to actually invest that. So Quantitative Value, Quantitative Momentum, very, very good books. They provide a really interesting framework for thinking about how you might apply systematic rules to investing. Now, if you want to go even more advanced, then you start to get into the world of machine learning and even potentially AI and algorithms in stock picking or stock trading. You start to get closer to the world, for instance, of quant hedge funds and maybe even high frequency trading. But Ernest Chan is actually one of my favorite authors because the world of quantitative investing is really hard. In fact, that's why you see a lot of PhD mathematicians actually in that field. And so it's a really tough topic because you got to go into a lot of really advanced math in some cases, but Ernest actually does a good job of breaking down some of the more practical parts of quantitative investing and what you have to think about and how to deal with some of the common misconceptions and software pitfalls. And so these two books, Algorithmic Trading and Machine Trading, are both great. Really anything that Ernest puts out there is great because it's accessible to people that are not necessarily PhDs. At least some of it is. So I find that to be pretty helpful. And then if you want to go really, really deep, then a book like Advances in Financial Machine Learning by Marcos Lopez de Prado is really like the practitioner's guide and goes through a lot of actual code examples of how to apply machine learning to financial markets. So in the category of, or at least staying on the topic of advanced topics in investing, if you're interested in options and derivatives, I've got a couple here books that I think are really good. So if you were looking to get into especially things like equity derivatives, call options, put options, vertical spreads, calendar spreads, stuff like that, Lawrence McMillan is probably the guy you want to read first. He's got a couple books out there, Options as a Strategic Investment, and then one called McMillan on Options as well. And both of those books are just a really, really good way to start to understand some of the strategies and math behind derivatives in a way that's relatively accessible for someone who is a layman and not a PhD in mathematics. So I recommend those as a good starting point if you want to learn about options and option strategies. Now, if you're going to go deeper and you're going to actually look at some more complicated options hedging and volatility trading and things like that, then you might pick up a book, Sheldon Natenberg's Option Volatility and Pricing. And this book starts to go a lot deeper into the Greeks and hedging and second order derivatives and just volatility trading and gamma and things like that, and just a lot of really more detailed concepts. This book is not going to be accessible for a beginner. In fact, this is probably going to take a bit more mathematical grounding. But it is seen as one of the core textbooks for people who want to go deeper into derivatives. On the fixed income side, got you covered as well. This is the Bible of fixed income, as it's sometimes referred to. It's actually called The Handbook of Fixed Income by Frank Fabozzi. And as you can see by the thickness of it, this covers a tremendous amount of material. It goes into a lot of the complexities of bond math. It goes into interest rates, term structures, inflation, how that affects bonds. It goes into even interest rate derivatives and stripping bonds into different strips. And so this really just touches on all the major topics related to fixed income. And it's going to be a hard one to read cover to cover, but it is a great reference too. So this, again, the Bible of fixed income, really, the Handbook of Fixed Income is what it's actually called. And then if you're interested in distressed debt and looking at companies and companies' debt who are going through restructurings or bankruptcies, this is the best textbook that I found on the topic called Distressed Debt Analysis by Stephen Moyer. And it's actually a pretty easy read as far as, for a really advanced topic like distressed securities, which involves a lot of legal terms and going through, the waterfall of the capital structure and understanding how things play out in the complicated bankruptcy processes. And what that means for different claims on a company. So, but a really good one if you want to get into distressed debt and looking at distress and reorganization opportunities. So that really covers a lot of the main investing books. Actually, there's a couple here I want to talk about as well that I don't have on the desk, unfortunately. I have them on my Kindle, but I'll mention them because they're worth mentioning. So 100 Baggers is a recent book. It was written in the last couple of years by Chris Mayer. It's actually about how to find stocks that could potentially return up to 100x the initial investment. He goes through some of the examples of stocks that had delivered that kind of massive return and what it takes to find them early. So that's a really, really good one. Any of the books by Michael Mauboussin, I think, are in the category of the more technical, but really help understand fundamental analysis and corporate finance at a deep level. So Michael Mauboussin has a couple books out there. He also has some papers online that are worth reading. He delves into topics like return on invested capital and valuation, and I think those are are really, really valuable. The other one in that category too, around the topic of capital allocation, which is how company managers really determine what to use the company's cash flows on. Should they go for an acquisition? Should they buy back stock? Should they pay dividends? Should they reinvest in the business? That is a really key decision that drives a lot of stocks returns over a long period of time. And in that topic, I think one of the best books on that topic from an investor's perspective is a book called At the Outsiders, and it's not the one by S.E. Hinton. It's called The Outsiders: 8 Unconventional CEOs and I believe their radical blueprint, or their radically rational blueprint for success. So again, I think it's The Outsiders: 8 Unconventional CEOs and their radically rational blueprint for success. That's a mouthful. But it's a really, really great book, and it actually has some case studies of companies and managers who had multi-bagger stocks and what they did to achieve that, and a lot of it revolves around smart capital allocation. And so as an investor, it helps us think about, what do you look for in CEOs and CFOs that are running the companies you're investing in, and what makes for a good capital allocation decision that can deliver good returns going forward. So I think that's a really, really fantastic book to pick up. And that really just touches on a lot of the investing specific books, but there's a whole universe of business related books out there that we could talk about. I've got a few here today, but again, I'll probably make a separate video on books that deal with just general topics in business. But certainly anything written by Nassim Taleb is worth a read. Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan, those are both great books to help really understand from a societal or investor perspective what it means to deal with extreme events and how to price those into investing and daily life, and how to think about long tails in your life. And I just find a lot of the mental models from Taleb to be very, very thought-provoking. Books like 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. I know Peter gets a bad rap for some of his viewpoints, but 0 to 1 is a really fantastic book in terms of understanding monopolies and corporate strategy and what really drives amazing outcomes in the business world, especially from the VC perspective. So that's a really good one. The Snowball, anything Warren Buffett related is worth a read. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but The Snowball is probably the best biography ever written about Warren Buffett. And you'll have a lot of detailed deep dive in here about the investments he's made and why, and the thinking behind what he does. And so I find that to be really, really insightful, because Warren, again, is one of the greatest investors of all time. And there's a couple other sources I think that are very, very helpful to help understand his mindset as well. You can look at, you can actually read, there's a book called The Essays of Warren Buffett, and that distills a lot of his annual letters from the last 50 years into a shorter book that can actually help, you don't have to read 10,000 pages of annual letters. Instead, you can read the Essays of Warren Buffett, and I think that can be a little bit shorter way to get some of his wisdom. He also has out there are PDFs of the Warren Buffett partnership letters, and you can read those, and those can be really, really insightful too. In some of his letters, Warren actually gets into some pretty technical topics, from accounting to even pensions, but he also talks about what it means to find great businesses and how he spots those great businesses. So anything Warren Buffett I think is worth a read as an investor. And then there's a host of others. There's a lot of like entertainment related investing in business books. Books like Bad Blood or The Everything Store, Shoe Dog. Those are great, fantastic books for insights into great companies, and so those are useful as well. But if we went through every single book that's worth a read in business and investing, we'd be here for a week or two. So, well, that's it for me today, y'all. Hopefully you found this valuable, and you've got homework for probably the next couple of years. But if there was an area where I didn't provide a good rec for you, hit me in the comments, and I'll try to reply with a good recommendation. I'm going to link up each one of these books in the show notes as well, so you can go ahead and click on those and buy them if you want. And if you did find this valuable, please hit the like and the subscribe buttons. Share it with anyone who you think would find this valuable. And happy reading.